Hello, and welcome to the fifth episode of the show, Cardinal Directions. And today we're going to be talking about rewarding your players as well as magical items, how to give them out, how to create them yourselves, and maybe all the purposes they can have within your game. So I am Axel, I'm a dungeon master for now almost 3 years. I've played in multiple campaigns, and to my right on the screen is Pat. Pat, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hello, I'm Pat. I'm a DM. I've been DMing for 2 years. And what about you, Nick?
Yeah, well, I'm Nick. Thanks for spoiling my name, in case anyone didn't know after 5 episodes. It's still Nick. Probably be for a long time. I've been a DM for 2 years, on and off, some commitment issues from all sides involved. But yeah, that's about it.
Thank you, guys. Today, two topics we had, rewarding your players and magic items. We're going to begin with rewarding your players because that is the base. After each adventure in Dungeons & Dragons, it's common that you give out to your players some rewards for the tasks they have accomplished and the challenges they have pushed through. These rewards can take multiple forms, and we all know the simplest form of reward you can give your players is gold, but there are other things you can give them. And we're going to talk about why you should give maybe one type of reward over the other, or what you can do to make your rewards more interesting to your players. So let's talk about gold first. What's your modus operandi in terms of giving gold rewards to your players, Pat? When does that happen?
Um, Usually at the low tier of play. You give gold all the time. Like you find the gold in a dragon's hoard, you find the gold on a corpse of a bandit. But usually when there's a low level party specifically looking for quests in a city, then usually the reward for those quests is going to be more often than not gold. And I usually give, depending on the level, certain amount, which I can like imagine how much could be bought for it. And my players will like put the gold together to buy something more powerful for one of the persons, which I think is cool. But it can also go unused. I've noticed like especially new players don't know what to do with the gold, right? If you don't know offhand that you can buy a better armor because you don't know the armor table, or that you might buy a healing potion if it's even available in the game, then gold's a little bit useless until you can actually find a way to spend it.
Mm-hmm. So I would agree with giving gold in early levels because that's also when the players need the gold the most because they don't have their basic equipment yet. And they might still have to pay for living expensive and basic stuff like, going to the tavern and slaying there for the night. So that might be the time when they need the gold the most. And that's also the time when it's generally kind of new. At least in the beginnings of the campaign, you haven't had many rewards yet, and so having gold at this moment is you're not necessarily used to it. Nick, what do you think about like giving gold in terms of compared to other kind of rewards? What's the advantage in your mind?
Well, first of all, I want to disagree with it being a viable option for low-level play. If you have a full Dragonborn party, I like to play into the stereotype and only give them gold regardless of the level. Besides that, gold is boring because, you have gold, it's a resource you can use, but then you also force your players to use it, and most won't, and maybe they'll buy an ale and use it for role-playing, but honestly, I've never encountered a player yet that proactively will go out and say, well, I want to use my gold to buy this, unless it's like something big where like they have a castle or stuff and they want to buy stuff like that. Usually they go into a shop and they're like, oh, what's in the shop? And then you're as a DM, you're like forced to pull up a table or something and go like, well, this and this and this and this, and then they're like, oh, I want to buy that and that. So I don't like gold. Long story short, I don't like handing out gold.
Mm-hmm. In my experience, I think it is. I'm kind of like in the. Let's say what's the word? I'm kind of in the middle of both camps. I think gold is interesting to give to some degree, but one thing is once you have too much of it, you have to find a way to spend it, and that's going to be hard, as you just said, because the DM is going to basically have to give you opportunities to spend it, because as a player, you don't necessarily have, at least in my experience, you don't necessarily have options presented to you that are always there or that you can choose to take part in independently from the DM. Of course, D&D is a collaborative game, but you don't necessarily have rules for stuff you can buy. The DM kind of decides what shops are available and what the prices are, and so you're at the mercy of the DM in some ways. However, I think it's still useful in a way because it also serves as in lower levels as a barrier, basically. For me, one of the things in lower level plays, you can't necessarily afford everything, and that's the reason you can't necessarily afford a company of mercenaries to come with you on the job, because that's what you're getting paid for. That's what people pay you money for, and you can't, it's gonna be more expensive for you to maybe find someone else to do the job for you. And that way, you have a reason to go adventuring on your own. Maybe your goal was to help your mom out of poverty. That's your character, that's your basis, or you wanna create an orphanage, and that's your kind of short, medium-term goal. Then having gold can be a resource for that. But
it depends on your party alignment. If you're an evil party and you want to create an orphanage, there are other ways.
It's funny that it's like considered not a good reward in D&D, but like in real life, who would be like, I don't want gold. What am I gonna spend it on? In actuality, there's always something you could spend on. In lower tiers of play, you'll find your martial classes looking for better equipment. In higher tiers of play, you'll find your casters looking for spellcasting components. So many spells consume rubies or diamonds. In one of the games, I have a high-level wizard, and all I think about in my downtime is like, how can I make more money so I can afford another more ruby dust? For example, for my simulacrum or something.
I've never done that. And
Yeah,
I played a fair few marshals and spellcasters. I never had that problem. No.
Never wanted to buy a full plate for your warrior?
No.
Okay.
I think there are these iconic items, and that's true actually. That's a real good point, Pat, that you're talking about party composition, because if you have, for example, if you have a paladin, most of the time they're gonna want to get a set of plate armor. But that's extremely expensive. Generally, that's the big purchase. In my recent campaign that I found, some of my players wanted to upgrade their base weapons. And one of them wanted to get a longbow instead of a short bow. Another one wanted to get some splint armor, and then eventually go get plate armor. And if you have these types of characters, maybe a fighter that's defensive and more strength-oriented maybe, they might use these kinds of items more. And just in the same way, if you have a spellcaster like a wizard, they're going to be spending a lot of money. However, on the other hand, if you have a druid and a ranger in your team, they might not need much money because they can sustain themselves and live outside without a problem. Maybe if you have a bard, and then you can get things for cheaper, or you can get good deals or good contacts everywhere. So I think it heavily depends on the party composition you have, if gold is very useful or if it's just extra in a way.
I mean, there are certain classes that are more dependent on equipment than others. Like a fighter is kind of reliant on a DM giving them a weapon or money to afford it, or upgrade armor. There's not many ways they can do it. Whereas most of the spellcasters have some spells that don't require to buy components. So I think it depends on your players. Like again, in my game, I had my artificer ask me where he can buy a pearl because he wants to cast Identify. That's 100 gold, at least. So there's ways to spend gold. You just have to inform your players somehow. Like what I did with my new players was I told them, guys, you're in a city. Maybe you want to go to the shop, see if there's some weapons that you want to buy. And I basically railroaded them into going and spending their gold because I knew that they wouldn't otherwise. But I think they were happy.
Wait, let me get it straight. You railroaded your players into a shopping session?
I meta-wise presented them with the information that they might want to spend their gold.
Axel, do you hear this guy?
I would agree, actually. Because I have found in my newer campaign, because I wanted to have a lot of other ways to spend gold. Because if you follow basically the simple, I guess, schematic of D&D of like you go adventuring, you go back to town, you go to the tavern, then you go back adventuring, you don't have a lot of ways to spend gold. And in my world, I don't like having magical items in shops available all around. I like to give them out and make it something special so that the players don't earn gold and then they spend it. Instead, they find this relic and it's gonna have history, it's gonna have flavor behind it. It's not just, oh, I just enchanted this +5 holy adventure last night in my shop. So I think it is good to give them options, and as a DM, sometimes you have to tell them because in other games they didn't have these options. So for example, in my game, I told them you can spend gold to get plot hooks. There is an actual system of something they call dust piles, basically, because this is a kind of a pirate campaign, and so you can buy these pieces of information that can lead you to treasure or lost civilizations and stuff like that, and they're hoarded by a specific company. And so your gold can be used to buy information. But you can also use the gold to do something else, and that's something the players won't necessarily have in mind. For example, you can use your gold to bribe people. You can use your gold to help out a shop or pay for a bridge and make yourself, more popular. You have different ways of spending that gold. But you gotta present it.
That's a great idea, because that's what I was about to say before Pat went about shopping railroading session.
It was like 10 minutes, not a session.
You railroaded them into a shopping session. That's all I'm saying.
Sure.
Even though it was just 10 minutes, it still counts. Anyway, you can make gold more important. Like me personally, I don't like gold because I find it kind of boring to hand it out to, have players shop and stuff. Just give them the stuff. But you can make it more important. Be able to, instead of buy items, buy influence. Well, maybe a bit too close to real life. But, you can like think of different systems where to use the gold. Like it's just a different resource that your players can use if you give it to them.
Yeah, I like the idea that Axel said about buying information, specific quests. You can buy yourself a quest.
Yeah.
To search for treasure or for interesting things. Yeah, in my game there's like a lot of magic items available, so I like the idea that my players can go get a lot of gold and I can decide what they want to spend it on, or if they want to maybe create their own magical items we can talk about, which makes the player more involved into what they're getting, and it's not just a random magic item or something that I thought was balanced, but something we all talked about.
That makes sense as well. One last kind of like reward I wanted to talk about for gold that you can use it for, and it ties into the future topics that we're gonna talk about, which is other types of reward. But for example, if you remember, Nick, in the campaign you had together, you guys had a castle, and you had like upgrades and system like that you can do. You can build things into the castle, and I feel like that is also a great way to allow your players to spend gold as a DM and as a player, because as a player you get customization and you get to build something that stays there. Because let's be honest, most D&D adventures, you go from one side of the world to the other, you never quite stop for a long time, and you don't feel like your character is necessarily part of the world here. Doesn't have, a title, a place. You may have saved the world, but you're still not a nobody, but you're still that like that rascal basically on the side of the road.
Yeah.
Whereas if you give your players opportunities to have a title, have a rank, have a castle maybe, first of all, they feel more engaged into the world. But second of all, it gives them a way to spend their money on choices, on things they can choose. And it's bonuses that aren't necessarily always mechanical, but they can be story-based, and that allows the players to have their own personal arc from what they do with their gold. Maybe they build like a big-ass temple in their castle, and then a lot of people come for pilgrimage at their temple, and all of a sudden the players have made like a huge impact on the world without having to kill anything. And
it also generates passive income, which is also maybe too close to real life. But I like it. It's also a good progression system, actually.
Yeah, that's what we talked about. To the goal in the campaign we played with Nick, the goal with their castle eventually was to make it fly and have it You just fly around
Yep.
and be able to move it. But that's, very
Yep.
expensive
Flying
and it
castle.
requires allies. But it's super cool. And so you have this thing where they started with a castle that was broken down. They rebuilt it back up. They added an alchemy lab. They added research facilities. They added a banquet hall. I don't know how to say
Banquet.
it. Banquet. Thank you.
I think. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I know how to say it in French. Anyways, they had all these kind of things, statues and stuff like that, and the castle was fancy, so they could invite people and have a
True.
higher standing in a way.
And it also made you work in Dungeon Draft because we had you repaint Crackmore Castle
That is
a
true.
whole lot.
That was fun. But so, anyways, I think we have reached upon the ways of how you can use gold to not only allow your players to buy stuff, but also different things you can do with the options of buying stuff. But now I wanted to talk, because we talked about information right before this, buying information with gold, but what about giving information to your players as rewards? Pat, do you have any experience with that?
I don't know if it's exactly that because sort of over it just sort of crosses over an item. But in my game, I had recently there was a mystery going on. There was these attacks, mysterious creatures appearing. Where are they coming from? And one of the essentially optional quests that were tangled into the main story was acquiring this object that would basically like a focus for a divination spell, so they could divine some information about these creatures. And so yeah, basically there was a small like material reward for acquiring this item because the powers in the game wanted to have this conflict resolved themselves, so they were invested and they were given a reward. But also, the getting of the item itself facilitated more information regarding the main conflict in the game at the time. So I think it was kind of satisfactory. Let me do some exposition that would be otherwise impossible. Something like a scry at level 5. Um, I don't usually. I don't have like a system that the characters can just get some information from money, but it's a good idea that you said, Axel.
Dick, do you have any
Well,
experience with that? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. For it to work, though, the premise is that your players actually want this information. They need to be invested in it somehow, because otherwise it's not a reward. It's just moving the story along. And what I did in my campaign was that I had like a hidden antagonist in a way. So the antagonist gave them the quest, and the information reward was, well, guys, you're doing a job for the bad guys who's out to get you. And that immediately made them invest. I don't know how much they realized it was a reward to tell them that because they successfully completed the quest, but I feel like handing out information works if it's presented in a way that the party is invested in information as a reward.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think I've done it. I've done both in the past. I've done giving out world lore in general to my players, and I've also given specific information about plots that they cared about. The first one I did I had this dwarven dungeon, not going into details too much, but at the end they found a laboratory that had multiple books, and that talked about creatures that are called titans in my universe. They're these big ass, almost like mythological creatures that represent the spirits of chaos in a way and order, and have a tendency to change the world around them. And they were awakening. And so finding these books gave them information on whatever was happening in the world so that they were more prepared than everyone else and maybe could start doing something about it if they wanted to. However, what I realized was that they didn't necessarily do something about it this time. They read the books, I gave them the information, and then I don't think it actually ever got used. So I think that's a good point about like giving them information that they care about, because I think at this point it was probably too early. I was trying to do some foreshadowing, but it didn't work. But the other side of it worked. What I did recently was players were going on quests, and they got a message from what seemed to be like an old friend in a city that was corrupted by the government there, And so that old friend took them into a dungeon type structure, and at the end, they realized he was actually there to betray them. They managed to escape, and escaping, while they didn't get necessarily any valuable monetary rewards, they got information about what the corrupted government was doing. And because one of the players had this kind of segment in their backstory talking about this corruption and the people behind it, immediately he was super invested. And following that, the rest of the players were also invested. They wanted to know what had happened, and the information that I had given as a reward all of a sudden made them like more invested than they were before, because that was something that they had so little information about. So I think the lesson that I learned from this is, if you want to give information to your players as a reward, a good way to do that is to, in a way, starve them of information. For example, if it's like a thieves guild or a very secret conclave somewhere, finding information on that is very valuable. If it's just random world lore or things that are immediate or that they don't care for now, it might not have the same impact.
That is very true. But that's rewards in general, isn't it? For them to be impactful, they need to hold a meaning. Like if I give just out random items, right? Even if they're magic items, my players will enjoy them, of course. They're like, oh, magic item, shiny, I like. But if they have a connection to the story, either personal of the characters themselves or overarching story in the world, it will always feel more special. If they also, because then you can pivot from this is the reward, but it's also a plot hook, which I personally enjoy very much, where it's like a dual purpose of what you're giving your players.
Yeah, it's even better if the players seek out the reward, be it information or item themselves.
Yes.
Because at that point it's just easy. They already want it, and
Exactly. I remember Axel gave us a stick, and we were like, that was like literally. Okay, so story time. We went out into the marshes, found an oracle. I'm abridging this, like it's super brief. We found an oracle, and we had like a stick. He gave us a stick, and we're like, this stick is gonna be super important. Like we never figure out what this stick is for. It's just a stick, a wooden stick. Like what do we do with this? It was the best reward ever because it just kept us occupied for like so long.
That is true. I think it depends on the players, but of course we had players that were curious, and the player I specifically handed it to directly was a kind of a childlike character, and so that helps. But I think if you can make it interesting, if you can make it unique, players will probably care about it. If you put it in like if the theming is appropriate to their character. So don't try and give a Death Knight helmet to a druid, but maybe if you give the druid a special plant or even like a book on special plants, and maybe there's this magical plant in there that's important to the plot, they'll enjoy it. So I think we went around information pretty well. I had some external items that I wanted to talk about, but this is like castles and stuff like that. We have kind of talked about that already. However, there's another way to reward your players after the quests, and that is not tangible. That is influence. There are many sorts of influence, political, religious, military, but you have a number of options within D3. So let's start with Nick this time. Nick, do you have an idea of in what ways you could use these rewards to give your players influence, and what would that be good for?
Of course, I actually used that one in my campaign. It was the first reward I ever gave out. And it encouraged to not be a murder hobo, because what my players did was they, to set up the campaign, they were captured. And they captured their captors in turn when they broke out, and they brought these people, bandits in fact, to the city and handed them over for bounty. And I didn't just give them a bounty, I also gave them permission to be officially licensed bounty hunters, And suddenly they had some influence in a city and were allowed to investigate crimes, which was very helpful because they could move freely in the city, which otherwise they could have not done. And it also, at least in my mind, I don't know if it was just my players, probably was, and I had nothing to do with it. But in my mind, it also encouraged them to not be murder hobos because they realized, oh, hey, if we hand over bad people alive and they go to prison, we'll get money and influence.
Yeah, I think it's a very valid way of doing it. And having been in that campaign, I can tell there's something about earning titles and reputation that feels good. I don't know if this is a dark comparison to the real world where, reputation doesn't necessarily come from good means necessarily, but I feel like there's really something as a player that, I don't know, just tickles my fancy when you get these titles. And I have a very small example before I give I let Pat talk about his experience. But from my first offline campaign, actually, my first 2 years long campaign that I finished about like a year ago now, one of the players was playing an elf that really liked, basically, he was really narcissistic. And he really liked titles. And so, what I did frequently was give them titles as a reward. And they would even choose titles over something else. And by the end of the campaign, the player had like maybe 25 titles or so, because each time they chose to forgo the reward, give it to back to the people or to the town, and just take a new title instead, and maybe have like a statue posted somewhere of themselves. But also by the end of the campaign, everybody knew about them because they kept just saying their name out loud, and there were statues of them everywhere. And so in a way, that player, while not having gotten rewards in terms of tangible things, they were rewarded because their character was basically now a celebrity.
It's interesting you guys say about this. I mean, in my games, I would have, whenever a certain area was perhaps saved from a disaster or some great calamity was averted, obviously there would be some recognition for the party and the characters. But I don't know if I would call it influence. And I even noticed at least my players didn't really stay around in one place long enough for it to matter. Because as long as a problem at hand was resolved, they'd be like right away going somewhere else. It never really came into play, at least in the previous two campaigns I ran. This time around, I'm thinking maybe there will be an opportunity to, because my players right now have like a base of operation and a small hideout in a city that they are helping, so there could be a opportunity there to possibly have consequences to the fact that they help out a lot around.
Yeah, are they planning to build their hideout, or is it just a shack?
I don't know right now, and I don't really want to like ask them not to influence the choices too much.
Oh no, like not ask them as their DM. Ask them as the mayor of the nearby town if they don't want to stay and offer protection to the village.
I might do, but right now it's like in the middle of action, so we'll
Right.
see.
No, I'm
When I go
just
back.
mentioning it because we talked about castles and stuff as a reward.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
feel like base building totally ties into that. Also with the influence, right?
Mhm.
Because you're only allowed to build your base in another person's land. Like I'm obviously extrapolating this from like a feudal setting, like a fantasy, medieval fantasy setting. But you usually don't hold land unless you're like a person of influence. So kind of it ties in together with the reward system.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah.
I suppose the fact that the characters are like working for the government of the city is already allowing them entry into many places. But I don't think the PCs realized this. It was uh, maybe I did a bad job of um showing that, but yeah,
No, it's the
I'm
player's
excited
fault.
to yeah. But I'm excited to maybe see if I can give some influencer words, see how they react, and if it's at all um interesting to them.
In my experience, I feel like it's a good way to make sure that the players have stronger ties to the NPCs or the locations. But of course, as you said, it depends on the type of campaign. Because if you have a campaign that's a lot of traveling and moving around and not staying in the same place almost at all, then influence is going to be difficult to value because, well, you're not going to see these people probably again or anytime soon. So your influence has less of an effect. But if you have a campaign where you have, for example, a city that most of the time you come back to and then you come back from, that way you can have the same NPCs that are there. You can have the same locations, and your character can more have a settled section of the city for themselves, or can work on building their base because they're always there instead of not building it because they're always traveling, and then who cares about the base?
Yeah, it depends on your campaign also. If you have a very sandboxy campaign, it's difficult to suddenly say, well, we're just going to stay in this area and build a base. It's just not in the forefront of most players' mind if they enter into a sandbox campaign. But if you're like, oh, we're playing in this city or this country, you're very, very much limited into the places you can go, like faraway places, then it's more plausible for players to be like, oh, maybe we should settle down if we're in the area anyway.
Yeah, I think it depends on the players.
For the new campaign I've been running, I've actually used a boat for that as a mobile base. Because the section where they're going is mostly sea-based and there are islands all over. And their boat is actually the thing they upgrade and the thing their base of operations. And exactly because I like factions and having a system of reputation and overall growing and going up higher and higher in ranks within the same faction and having bonuses for that. The heroes there are working for a trading company basically that needs help from mercenaries from time to time to clear out monsters, protect caravans, sometimes help build stuff. And so as they've been working for that company, they get more and more trusted, which allows them other advantages. For example, they can maybe make goods come from far away to them for either a much lower price or just even straight up without their influence, they couldn't do it. Or they can participate in auctions. I like having things that are gated behind being in a certain faction because I think that makes the world feel real. Like in real life. For example, in real life, if you're looking for the most expensive pieces of art in the world, you're probably not gonna get in the auction if you're not like a millionaire or more, if you're not in the club, basically. And I think having players be part of factions and evolve like this makes them feel in the club and gives them a sense of accomplishment regarding what they did. We helped them enough and now we're respected and we're in the club and we can do all that stuff that X or Y can't do necessarily. It gives them a lot of power. Maybe they can even take political decisions. So overall, I think giving influence to your players, it's a vast topic and there are numerous ways to do it. But I think if you haven't tried it in your own games, you should try and maybe think of ways you can reward your players in other ways than necessarily gold. And so influence might be a good choice for that. Does anyone of you guys have anything to add to this topic, or shall we go on to the next?
Towards influence?
Yes, towards influence.
Let me think. I mean, it all boils down to influence, is political by its nature, right? But you can think of different influences to grant your players. Maybe they're like a religious authority now. For example, Axel in his campaign, we pretty much established a Thunder Bunny religion with one of our characters because she cast lightning spell with gullible reptile folk in the area, and suddenly they were like, "Ooh, Thunder Bunny, she's blessed by the gods. She's a god herself." Or they have military influence where they overthrow governments. It's all nuance, but there's different influences that you can give your players, and there's probably always an appropriate type of influence that you can grant your party as a boon.
Mm-hmm. I think if you look at political, military, religious, information, stuff like that, I think you can almost always find something for your players that they're going to be interested in.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, let's go
Which
on
brings us-
ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was gonna say that brings us to items, right?
There is one last
magic
thing that
items.
I wanted to very quickly talk about. It's just personal goals, like giving character development options as a reward. And so Pat, you had a really interesting idea of, for example, having quests that are there to fix problems like removing a curse from your character, or maybe removing a curse from a magic item. How do you think that could be employed in a campaign to make your players feel good about their rewards while still technically not giving them anything?
I mean, depends. If it's something to do with core of their backstory, or if it's a major personal quest, then I think it'll be all veiled in um, a story and a larger sort of ordeal, and there'll be a culmination of some sort of story arc. But maybe just accidentally, a character gets cursed by a mummy, and now there's a problem because we're too low level to dispel it. And that could be a fun side quest, and it would be sort of where the game mechanics and the storytelling comes together to facilitate basically. Well, a little distraction maybe from what was done earlier. Maybe it's needed to be done now. Um, and we can go about it in many different ways, but it definitely would be a good way to reward someone. Something similar like this maybe would be how the players fight a creature who was using a corrosive weapon, and some of their equipment got destroyed, but that's just a monetary issue, honestly. But one of the characters has a prosthetic made of metal that got destroyed, and that's not something you can just buy on the market. So they can repair it themselves because they're an artificer, but they needed to go and find parts, which means they needed to explore this place where they've been other tinkerers and inventors previously, and that's a little side quest that I made for a session when one of the players couldn't make it, so it wouldn't move the main story forward. Instead, we had a little find some repair parts for artificer side quest.
I
For
like
example.
that a lot because it gets your party invested into each other's character's backstory. I love that. It's really good.
Yeah, that's true. You can tie a lot of
And
things.
it was a happy.
Sorry,
it was a happy accident because one of the players wasn't there. So.
But I think that was well handled because, you know, if one of the players missing, generally you don't want to, or you might not want to advance the main plot. So I think was really it's an example of using a plot hook as a reward in a way, because, or not necessarily a reward, because if you were cursed or, you know, your prosthetic is destroyed, it's not necessarily a reward. But at the same time, as a player, I feel like it gives you room to do things with your character that you wouldn't necessarily have otherwise. It forces you to go and develop your character through these moments. And I think that's also cool because, I mean, as a DM, sometimes, you know, you can give opportunities to your characters to have development and talk to each other and know each other better. But sometimes it's kind of difficult to push them to, especially if they're not necessarily prone to doing it by themselves or they're new players. And I feel like having these kinds of plot hooks as rewards, or resolving personal conflicts as rewards, that can really help your players to allow themselves and feel okay with, okay, now I have to deal with this in the life of my character. How would my character deal with this circumstance? Now I have only one arm. You know how they're gonna react in this moment. Are they gonna be panicked? Or are they gonna be blah blah blah? And what happens if they get it back or they don't? And so in a way, it's less like, it's even more ethereal than influence. It's almost like a meta reward, right? It's like you're
It's like a
rewarding
story
the
reward.
players.
Yeah, it's even less tangible because really what you're doing is you're forcing them to interact with their character and to play that character in a different, well, not necessarily different way, but you're like forcing interaction.
It's almost as if the story was the reward itself. You know?
Oh my
Almost,
God.
yeah.
Is this like
Man.
the moment where we're like it's all about the friends we made along the way?
This
Yeah.
is too deep now.
It's almost like playing D&D is a reward in it of itself.
Yes,
Yeah.
pretty much.
It's also a small additional benefit to it because I think the artificer himself didn't know about the workshop, but our druid did, and druid was very like antisocial and not very friendly. And it was the first time that character was like, "Yeah, I don't care about the workshop, but I'm gonna go tell our artificer because I know he's gonna care about it." That was pretty cool.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's exactly like pushing character development and even making them interact with each other. That's even better. All right. So I think we went over the different types of rewards, but we avoided the one that is, I believe, most talked about in D&D, which is magic items. So there are tons of magic items. I'll put some sound effects on it. There are tons of magic items in the game. A lot of them were made by Wizards of the Coast. Others were made by third parties, and of course, a lot of it is homebrew. So, what is your experience in general with giving magic items to your players? Do you have a simple comment to make about your experience in general, you guys?
What do you think, Nick?
I like giving magic items that say they're magic, but they're actually just bad. Like a ring of invisibility, where when you put on the ring, it becomes invisible.
It's just being mean. It's just bullying your players.
No, it's not. It's a magic item, and it says ring of invisibility, and it does exactly what it says. Just following the letter of the law, you guys.
I had on that note, because it's kind of funny, I wouldn't do it normally, but because I had the concept of this village with like trickster kobolds, like just like liking pranks and stuff, I had a little list of prank magic items. One of them would be like the ring of evasion, but what it lets you do is evasively like answer a question rather than actually evade an attack. So
Oh,
it's still useful,
that's very
but
interesting.
but it wasn't doing what the name suggested. Like if you go on
That
magic
honestly,
items.
that is a really good item. If you ever murder hobo anyone, and local police force is casting Zone of Truth.
Yeah. It is. It's actually useful.
I'm putting this out there right now for your party to listen to. Right? It's pretty much a guaranteed get out of jail free card.
Don't listen to Nick, kids. That's that's how you end up in county jail. All right. Well, thank you guys for your quick synopsis, talking about your experience with magic items. That was pretty much what I was asking for.
No problem.
But you know, magic items, they're the classic reward of D&D. When you imagine a D&D game, you imagine magic items. And while the game was not balanced with magic items in mind, is what the Wizards of the Coast are saying. Basically, everybody always has magic items. Even in low magic settings, you have a couple of them. And there are, I mean, if you're not playing with magic items, in my opinion, why play D&D? There are plenty of other systems that work well with low magic, and I feel like one of the things that is attractive about D&D are the magic items. And that is because they can do pretty much anything. They have a large variety of things they can do. They can be modified, they can be crafted depending on the systems you use, and so they're a very varied type of rewards that you can tailor to your players, but also not tailor to your players, and that's still interesting. So as a DM, when you're giving out rewards, you have to choose what you're giving out. In Gold, you just give an amount. There are rules for that in the DMG or all around. You can ask on the internet, and that's pretty easy to find out. However, with magic items, it's more complicated because they're more powerful, but they also have more value like on the market as well. You can sell them, for example, but you can also use them. And depending on the party and the campaign, they might have different power levels. So, Pat, how do you choose what kind of magic items, what rarity, for example, you give to your players? How do you decide?
Well, there's a lot of factors going into it, but one thing to consider is the level of the party and the difficulty of the campaign, because maybe you don't need to balance it that much because you don't want your players to face a great danger. If you do want your characters to have a tough time, then every time you give a magic item, you also have to think about how you're going to upscale the next encounter, because otherwise it's going to be too easy. And maybe it depends on what you and your players want. You might go either way. Other things are like certain abilities belong to certain classes, and maybe giving them out to others is diluting the uniqueness. But at the same time, maybe it's good. Maybe it's like giving them an additional edge, especially if you don't have that ability available in the party already. I think that's a good idea then to add. In general, well, there's some instructions, some tips in Dungeon Master's Guide. For example, the tiers of play. If you look at just the simple magical +1 +2 +3 weapons and armor, usually at the first tier of play, you don't get magic items. Around level 5, you start getting +1 weapons. Around level 10, 11, you get a +2, and around 15, 16, you get a +3. But that's very basic stuff. I think certain classes require some magic items to make them fun. If you're a fighter and you don't have a magic weapon, it just sucks, right? A wizard without magic items can go by. There's enough variety in the class that you don't need a magic item as a wizard. But if you're a monk or a fighter or a rogue, it's just your class abilities are not that sophisticated.
Yeah, it's for flavor as well as for having different options. Okay. Yeah, you talked about having roles in the DMG, so we've seen there are a couple of tables in there. One of them talking about the different levels of rarity that you give to what levels of characters. Generally, if I believe correctly, if I remember correctly, you avoid giving you give rare items from like level 5 to level 10. Very rare from level 10 to 15, and then eventually legendary items above that. And common can be... Common items generally don't have a lot of power, a lot of functionality, so you can pretty much give them out willy-nilly, depending. And uncommon items are basically, for me, the first thing of what I would consider as magical items having an impact on the balance of combat and stuff like that. So in this episode, we wanted to talk about how to give out magic items. We're not gonna go over the whole magic item topic because that would be numerous hours of talking about it. But we wanted to give you, if you're a new DM or if you're a DM that's struggling with finding good rewards for your characters, we wanted to give you information on how you can choose whatever you give to your characters. And so we wanted to start from the simpler options. And the simpler options, I believe, is just taking items that already exist. So Nick, how would you go about choosing which items that already exist to give out to your players?
Pretty easy, because it does tell you in the DMG actually, I think. Somewhere around page 280 something, 85, 84 maybe, around there. It says create. I think it's about creating a magic item. Anyway, they go into detail about modifying an item, where, for example, an item that exists can only be used by a certain class or be attuned by a certain class. You can change that, give it out to whatever class you think fits. You just created your magic item, homebrewed it, technically, by modifying an existing item, and you already know it's balanced, so pretty much works out. It just works, actually. It doesn't just work out. It just works.
Alright. So you would, for example, take a spell and then give it to a player. Which is a way of...
exactly.
Go ahead.
I mean, you could also think of, like, I don't know, there's a X +1, right? And I'm sure there's a sword +1. I don't know all the magic items by memory, but if your paladin or your fighter uses, I don't know, a super special weapon, you just switch the attributes around. You interchange one for the other, and there you go. New magic item works for your party. There you go. Easy.
Yeah, that's true. Sometimes it can be as simple as just adding a +1 to the item, even though it's not the most flashy. Most marshals, for example, really want to have at least a magical weapon, whether it's +1 or just magical, but to bypass resistances and immunities by level 5, because the game starts being balanced against these resistances. Pat, what's your experience in regards to giving out magic items that either already exist or are pretty close to the base?
Well, some magic items that already exist are so popular, like a bag of holding, for example, that they just the name gets tossed around the playing table, and you should assume that they exist somewhere in the game, even if you can't buy them straight up. But I usually, when I prepare an adventure for my players. I think up at least concepts of magic items. I don't really go looking for them in the list offered by the official books. I usually have an idea, maybe inspired by a monster, ability, a spell, or whatever piece of fiction that I consumed, and then try and usually compare it maybe to a spell already exists or an effect, and try and balance it that way, or just from my experience, knowing that hopefully this thing will not be too powerful or not powerful enough at the given level.
I really like that, using existing spells or monster abilities to create a new item. Because I always imagine that's how magic items like were made in the first place. Wizard figured out a spell, and someone else figured out how to enchant an item with that spell, to industrialize it. For example, I don't know, like Featherfall, or like you just put that on an item and suddenly you can jump down buildings and be a window cleaner. I don't know.
Yeah, and you have a like item like that, right? You have a Ring of Featherfall, and it's good
exactly.
because it frees up spells from casters, or it gives an ability to a person that doesn't have spells to have this cool. It works especially well with utility spells. Yeah, Featherfall, any number, like I could imagine like an item that allows you to breathe underwater, or
True.
other things like that.
Or a spell of haste where your movement speed get for like traveling, not a combat traveling, but like over land distance,
Very specific.
Because it happened in my campaign. Supplemental book by Cobalt Press had a neat little spell that allowed you to travel at like 5 times the horse's speed over 48 hours without being exhausted or anything. Just saying, completely broke my campaign, but I'm not complaining or anything.
What level was that spell? 1 or 2?
It was a first level spell,
Oh, was first level spell?
It was a first level spell.
For any of you guys who
Almost
don't know
as
what
good
we're
as
talking
Featherfall.
about, there's a spell called Tireless in the Midgard setting book, which is really powerful. And so we broke the next campaign using that.
Yep.
But I agree that it is really interesting to put these kinds of utility spells on items, because first of all, they're going to be interesting. They're going to be interesting. Damage spells, you can cast Fireball. Well, they would probably be casting Fireball anyways. What you've basically given them would be a spell slot. If you have a wizard. Of course, if you have a full martial party, that depends. But let's just assume you have a balanced party with at least one spellcaster and at least, one martial in there. Utility spells are always useful, but at the same time, not always useful. And by that, I mean there are situational items, but these situations in general can be many. It really depends on your player's creativity. So, for example, if you give someone Ring of Jumping, well, that might all of a sudden change the way they approach combat or exploring because they have that Ring of Jumping. And while it's not like a crazy mechanical benefit, it makes for good flavor and it makes for emergent storytelling because of the way that item shapes their behavior in a way. So I think these utility spells are really good. And what you can do with magic items is you can even change the way they happen. For example, one item I created for another one of my campaigns is a what you call that? What you call a piece of fabric you use to clean up stuff? A rag. It is
a rag.
Yes, and it is
I
a
think
rag,
it's a rag
that could.
Nice.
That could.
Good job, guys. We did it.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, I'm still using Internet Explorer.
Yeah, it's a rag that could be used to cast grease, and I flavored it because the player that was gonna get that item was basically worked as a cook in a kitchen, and so keeping the theme of a restaurant, I flavored it as a waiter's rag, and basically when you could cast the spell grease with it by accidentally pretending to spill something on the ground that would cast grease. And then you could clean it up and recollect the grease into the rag and reuse it later.
Shouldn't the rag cast the spell grease though? Like
yeah, basically. So you pretend to like trip and let something fall that casts grease, And
Okay.
then you clean it up with the rag, and that removes the grease, and you can use it again. And
Yeah,
normally grease has a range, it might be concentration, but here, because it's a magic item, I can make it different. So I can make an item that does grease, but you can only cast it 10 feet away from you, like right next to you. But maybe it's not concentration, you can recall it. Maybe it's at will, it's like Featherfall at will, which is not extremely strong, but it is interesting and changes the way you behave. Or maybe it's just cantrips for characters that don't have these cantrips. All of a sudden, being able to shape water might make a lot of a difference.
yeah, I agree, and I think it's pretty cool, like to theme what the item actually does in the form of a spell after what the item is. Maybe not quite as wonderful as the Rag of Grease, but I had an item have what I came up on the fly with, as he asked me what the magic item merchant has on this. What's interesting? He casts magic, detect magic. What does he have? I'm like, okay, he has the amulet. So I have a little hourglass, and what the hourglass does, well, you can cast slow or haste once per day, your choice. So yeah, it's about time, it's about movement, so it's a little theme. And if you want to add more flavor to your items, there's actually some nice resources. So I don't really advise people to follow too closely the guide about creating magic items, but it's very general. There's not much information about it. But if you look at the chapter 7 treasure in the MG and go to magic items, special features, page 141 and on, there's lots of really cool tables. And not necessarily recommend rolling on them, but picking and choosing is really fun. You have things like, to add some flavor to the item, things like who created it, what sort of history it had, minor properties and quirks, and some of them are really cool. Also, later on, chapter 7, page 219, artifacts and minor and major beneficial and detrimental properties. These are really cool, can be really cool inspiration for magic items. And they allow you to balance it a little bit. So you can make a powerful weapon for your fighter, but it's gonna have some sort of detrimental property that makes it not as desirable. For example, I really like the miners one because they're deceptively powerful. I told you about it. I told you guys about it before, but there is one. While attuned to the artifact, non-magical flames are extinguished within 30 feet of you. When you think about it, let's say you have a very powerful weapon or a piece of armor that you go everywhere with because, well, it's just your signature piece of equipment. But wherever you go, the fireplace is getting extinguished, the torches and the chamber are getting extinguished. Everywhere is dark now and cold. And as soon as people figure out that everything around you is getting extinguished, they're probably not going to be that keen on hanging out with you.
Well, you see the negatives. The Gloomstalker in me says, "Dude, that's insane. I love that piece of armor. Give it to me right now."
Right. Well, there's a couple of other ones they like. There was one that didn't allow other people to sleep. Yeah, while you're attuned, creatures can take short or long rests within 300 feet of you. So you always come by yourself whenever you get ambushed, as long
Yes.
as you want to have it on.
Again, you see the negatives, and I see an amazing plot device of having an NPC wear that armor and the party wondering why they can't go to sleep.
Yeah, well, that could be used in many ways. I'm just saying, like, this is a really good inspiration for certain things.
They inspire me.
I
Yeah,
agree.
get inspired.
It's a lot of
Damn it.
flavor, basically, and I think this
Yes.
is what I like the most about Magic Item, because the mechanics can be interesting, but in general, if it's just flavor, I find that my players are less interested, or they use it as more like, basically they forget about it, or they get so used to just using it all the time that they don't really think about having the magic items. But I like when magic items are something cool that you remember. And so if you have these properties that all of a sudden makes the item way more personalized and way more interesting. It's not only a sword plus one, it's a sword plus one that glows when there are goblins nearby. I'm sure we have all seen
Where
that
have I
one
heard this
before.
before, Mr.
So
Junkie?
yeah, but you remember how in the movies that came in handy multiple times. And that was actually cooler than the blade just being a nice blade. So I think overall, you can create super interesting items with even just the minor properties.
Yeah, that's on a very microcosmos, but what just came into my mind is on a macrocosmos. As a DM, you always have to think about the availability of the magic items and how it would shape the world. If you have a lot of magic items of utility, for example, the feather fall or like the higher jumping available, like your society in the world would probably react to that with higher buildings, or maybe like deep, like underground buildings, so people can't jump as high. Like if magic items are readily available, their powers, at least in my mind, to keep like the world coherent, need to be appropriately reflected in the world. That's a lot of work.
I think I read like a post on Reddit recently about what if what if society had decanters of endless water available at all times, and that would change the world because then you don't need water infrastructure. You don't need to necessarily be by rivers, although it's useful for transport. But one of the main reasons people go by rivers is because you get water. So that changes the world. That's true. And as Pat was saying, just a minor detrimental property or positive property, such as extinguishing flames within 30 feet of you, might completely change the way things work. And you might even associate these two different classes of magical items. Maybe the ones forged with a special metal all have this property, or maybe it's a unique one. But that gives you options as a DM to make cooler items. And
yeah, I think. Sorry, Ron. I think like as if like NPCs and places, everything like magic items also should follow this having a theme and like making sense, even though it's a fantasy thing. When it all comes together, when the way it looks and it works mechanically and what's supposed to be in the fantasy of the story, if it all comes together, then it's very satisfying and memorable.
one thing actually I've been working on in my new campaign and trying to incorporate is giving more history to the magic items. Because you assume, at least depending on the lore you're using, I'm using a homebrew world with homebrew lore for the most part, but depending on the setting you're using, that might change. But in my setting, for example, magic items, for the most part, they take a while to make, and while there are enchanters nowadays still making items, a lot of them were made in the past, and because they're basically impossible to destroy, overall that's why there are so many now available, because people just kept making them for thousands of years in the past. But that also allows me, because these items have a past, to give some history, and so generally the way you find magic items is also tied to that history. The items themselves are flavored because they've been made by someone in a certain way, and the place where they're found and the way they're found also reflects that. And I think it's important in all parts of your DMing, not only rewarding your players or your encounters, to make sure you have theme behind it, you have flavor, and it adds something to the world. It's not just mechanical, and instead it really immerses your player within this world because that magic item is special.
Put the magic back into magic.
Exactly.
Nice.
Right.
That's €5 into the phrase pick. Is that a thing? Do we have that already? Where if we utter completely stupid and overused phrases, we pay into like a communal piggy bank?
We should do that. We should have a bingo card on screen that people can cross depending on stupid stuff we
I feel
say.
like I'm the only one who's paying stuff because I always have a stupid comment to make.
Oh, that's the illusion of the camera, because we say all the stupid stuff and then I cut it out.
Oh my god. The magic of editing. For example, it's also a magic item, really. Editing. Yeah, I think that's a wrap, guys. There's nothing more useful coming out of my mouth today.
Alright. There's just like one last little thing I wanted to mention, is building items from scratch. Because that's a really important thing, and that's what I've, for example, I was talking about the Grease spell, and in a way, I got some inspiration from a spell, but also basically the item came from a desire for me to make a rag useful. And so, Pat, you mentioned having done that in the past, making magic items from scratch. What's your process?
Well, thank you for putting me on the spot. Let me think. Usually it's to either complement a player's playstyle if it's like a reward. I had in a previous campaign, every player basically gets something similar to like I don't know, vestige from Critical Role, where they would basically get this one powerful magic item it would be like a reward for their story arc usually, or somewhere along the lines, and it would just reinforce their either like reinforce their shortcoming, making them very powerful, or just allowing them to do something. For example, and I asked my players what would they like, right? Because I wanted it to be satisfying. So it was partially also their input, and then we decided it would be balanced. One of my players wanted a very interesting item, I think, which was this druidic staff that allowed her to overload her own like spells. So she could pay with her life to increase the DC on her spells when she casted it. So that would basically ensure a success, possibly, at a very, very steep health cost. And even she it was cool because she suggested like pretty. It was pretty balanced. Like it was, if you really wanted to add a lot of bonuses, you were basically putting yourself at death's door right away. But it's pretty cool, and she used it a couple of times to pretty cool effect. So that'd be one way to go about it, to invest your players in it. Um, Completely out of scratch, I think I had a couple of items that like copy spells or like allow you to cast multiple spells. I had an item that expands the spell list for my sorcerer because sorcerers don't get that many spells. So instead of giving them just raw power and spell slots, it was just let's say a book of fire magic that just allows her to cast more different spells rather than more the same spell slots. Uh, Also magic items that are like a little bit of a creature that give you a perk are a cool idea, like a familiar that actually gives a bonus.
Pets.
Something like a pseudo dragon, but I don't know, different, better. Like a little friendly slime that gives you a little power up, for example.
Sounds like drugs with extra steps.
Right.
I see.
Me trying to figure out if there's anything truly extraordinarily unique that I ever came up with.
What do you think? So overall, if I understand correctly, you kind of look at the characters, look at what they would either need or like, and then go from there, which is kind of what we were talking about before, about finding items that expand your party's capabilities or make them better at what they're good at. I have a bit of a different method, I believe, for creating magic items. Is often I have a cool idea for flavor, and then I go
Right.
and try and make it useful afterwards. So
I do that too.
for the
Sometimes.
rag, for example, I just try and make something that's cool looking and generally has a cool concept, and then try and make that useful. The mechanics of that is pretty complicated to explain in such a format as the podcast, and I think it's something that takes a while to get used to, and thinking about it, you need some knowledge of the system and of your players and your game to understand what you can do with it and how to make it interesting. But it is a process, and you don't get good at something by not practicing it. So I would advise anyone watching, if you guys are new DMs or you're even experienced DMs but you've never done your own magic items, just pick a concept, pick an idea, anything, and try and make it into a magic item that is cool in some ways. And you'll get different results. Sometimes it'll be less cool than you expected, but overall, I think it'll make you a better DM overall, just being able to make cool shit.
Yeah, and don't be afraid of making mistakes in regards to creating an item. If it's unbalanced, maybe not necessarily take it away, but have a divine intervention where God nerfs an item. As long as it fits with the world, everything's possible.
Just talk to your player and explain how maybe you can
Yeah,
agree on
or
something else.
that would be very mature. I don't do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how many problems can be solved with communication.
You'd think so, but honestly, I feel like. Alright, fight me on this, okay? So I think,
Maybe.
of course, you can talk to your player. But if there is a way to solve an in-universe problem with an in-universe solution, that is preferable to out-of-game talk with your player.
It's a very situational. I think maybe it could be implemented, but I think it will more often than not feel unfair rather than. And actually, you can do both. You can have a conversation and then develop a in-universe logical reason.
That is actually very, very sensible, yes. Good talk, Pat. Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, communication is key. If you guys haven't seen episode 3 of this podcast, go ahead and watch it. It'll be available by the time you guys see this. And one last thing I wanted to talk about to close this up for the moment, because this is a huge topic again, but is talking about plot-based magic items. Magic items that aren't necessarily something the players will ever either want to use or be able to use, but they're magic items that serve the plot. I'll talk first about an example of such a magic item I had. My players in another campaign at some point were looking to fight one of these titans that I talked about, these large behemoth creatures that were forces of law or chaos within the world. And they were looking to fight one that was causing problems to the kingdom they were in. And so for that, they needed to prepare and get a magic item that was a large, like massive crystal that could power defenses against this creature. And so it was called the Mythal. And so while that magic item wasn't necessarily something they could ever use themselves because they didn't have the competency to use it, it was still something they had and could use for different effects. They might have used it for, giving them influence by giving it to an archmage, for example, but they could also use it in terms of its capabilities in different ways. And as such, like, that item, while it didn't have mechanics written down necessarily, it had a description, its capabilities were narrative, it still was really important for the players, and they kept it safe for a long time before finally using it as a barrier against the Titan itself. I think having magic items that don't necessarily have mechanics written down, but that have powerful effects can really change your campaign and make it interesting. I've read an advice from a piece of advice from one of the DMs on DM Academy recently that said, give your players a nuke. That'll make the game interesting. And that's true. I believe it is true. And while, it might make the game chaotic and you gotta be ready for consequences, generally, it makes the players extremely invested already because they have this powerful item, but that also means they might be followed, they might be searched for. Some people might want this item and want to take it from them. But also, because they have it, they have a lot of power. So all of a sudden, it kind of changes the dynamic of the campaign just by having one of these items. Pat, do you have an idea of an item used this way in your campaign?
I haven't really had that many specifically like one ring to rule them all story-driven items, like stories driven by an item. But I like your example actually, it reminds me of like a dodecahedron in like Critical Role, where it's a very important political piece that they are handling, but also has a very useful, minor, beneficial application that they keeps them using it. But at the same time, they're like hurriedly putting it in the safe of lead or then a bag of holding or something just to keep it secret, keep it safe. I'm actually planning something along those lines. One of my players in my current campaign has come out to tell me that they want to introduce this item to their backstory, and they know this is very OP. They don't want to get it right now, but they want it to be important and maybe later on come into play. And so now I'm in the phase basically of figuring out how I'm gonna introduce this item, who's gonna have it, or where it's gonna be. Still very working on it, but yeah, I think it's a very good idea to give them something powerful. Or very important, but also like have a benefit that you can use more mundanely as well. It seems to be a pretty good way to make sure they don't just leave it on the side of the road.
Mm-hmm.
And if they do, have a rival party find the item, use it against them.
Exactly. Yeah, it makes decisions either way, and it makes plot interesting. And I think it also gives flavor to the world, because that makes sense that these kinds of items would exist and be, looked after.
In fact, you can set up a whole thing with that. Like, there's the magic item itself, and then you can use it also as a MacGuffin to have the party run around for a few sessions to find it and get it. Like, there's a huge amount of variety that you can introduce with such a powerful magic item.
Yeah, totally. And introduce a fountain of youth in your world or something of the kind, and then have the players struggle to either find it or stop people from finding it. And then once they find it, what do they do? Do they use it? Do they not? I think it makes for a lot of very interesting decisions that you as a DM don't have to introduce yourself. You can just let the players interact with the item. And you have to be somewhat prepared of what's going to happen if they do basic things with it. but at the same time, it can also give you a lot of inspiration for plot hooks. So I would recommend trying it out at least at a small scale if you can't. Maybe give them, like an item that can, again, like a decanter of endless water that just gives out water. It's a small thing, but at the same time, it's something that would be very interesting for, I don't know, maybe smaller tribes of gnolls that don't necessarily have access to water because they live in the desert, or things like that. Maybe you have an oasis town that now the oasis is running out and the decanter is becoming super important. There's a lot of plot devices you can use with these items. Alright, well, I think we've pretty much reached the end of what we wanted to talk about today. As I said, it's a long topic, so we'll have to come back and treat it through other topics. Because DMing is a very interconnected art, I believe. So, kind of difficult to explain things all in a block. But to everyone that was watching so far, we hope you enjoyed the episode. We hope you'll leave a comment down below talking about your favorite magic items, or even, give us judgment on the magic items we presented, the problems they have, or the good things about them that you liked. If you liked the podcast and enjoyed it so far, leave a like, subscribe so you don't miss any more content. And in the future, I believe we'll be talking about more higher order things such as plot that might come from the future episodes. So we'll keep you guys updated in the meantime. Do you guys have any last thing to say?
Yeah, follow us on Twitter at Cardinal Direct 3.
Indeed.
Yep. Don't forget to love each other.
Oh yeah, true. Do love each other.
And is it first aid?
And don't let the bed bugs bite. Anyways,
you ruined it, Axel.
Thank you. I always do. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you guys next episode. And
bye.
Have a good week.
Bye bye.